Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. This is the 7th and final entry in a series of videos in which I've been reviewing each and every Warlord and signature squad we've seen released in the core set, and today I'm going to be looking at both the best and worst aspects of the first of our Tau faction Warlords. Keep in mind that although at this point we've seen the release of each and every expansion of the Warlord cycle of war packs, in this video I'm only going to be considering any of the card synergy contained within the core set itself. Although in future videos I'll not only be covering the non-signature cards for each faction in the core set, but the warlords of the Warlord cycle and beyond. But taking a look at the last of our core set warlords, today we discuss the unique unit Commander Shadowsun with the Soldier and Shas-O traits, an attack value of 1, 7 starting hit points, 7 starting hand size, and 7 starting resource tokens. And importantly, she possesses the text Reaction. After this warlord commits to a planet, put a Tau attachment with printed cost 2 or lower, or Shadowsun's Stealth Cadre from your hand or discard pile into play attached to an eligible unit at this planet. So, in taking a look at the most obvious aspects of Commander Shadowsun, although she does have a very reasonable pool of 7 hit points, that single point of attack value is fairly disappointing. Although we'll cover her signature army unit in much more depth in just a few minutes, important to keep in mind is that the Stealth Cadre can either interplay as an army unit or an attachment. But important to consider is that if you do decide to trigger her reaction ability, under no circumstance are you ever given the opportunity to deploy Shadowsun's Stealth Cadre as an army unit. You can either use it as an attachment, or you can either avoid activating this ability entirely. For that reason, although somewhat similar to another core set warlord we've seen, Packmaster Kith, that generates a potentially hard-hitting Chimera token upon her being committed to a planet, Commander Shadowsun doesn't quite have that same inherent, built-in ability to really ramp up her attack value. She has to rely on being committed to a planet that already has another one of your army units sitting there in order to reap any kind of benefit from these attachments. Important to note is that the Tau do have several options for printed cost 2 or lower attachments, and as with any of Fantasy Flight Games' living card games, it's only a matter of time until our card pool expands, and over the coming months and years, for the lifespan of this game, we'll only ever see additional options for Commander Shadowsun's ability. Although I've already pointed out that her statistical allotment is somewhat of a mixed bag, because of not only that paltry pool of hit points and missing out on what can potentially be a fantastic ability, but because she has such a meager attack value to fall back on, it seems of the absolute utmost importance that you prevent this warlord in particular from being bloodied under any and all circumstances. One of the absolute best aspects of this warlord is that you can choose to put into play attachments that happen to be in your discard pile. So not only does she have a built-in recursion effect, but you're also saving resources each and every turn, so long as you're doing your utmost to nevertheless leverage that printed cost of 2 or lower restriction in your favor. I've already touched on the critical importance of preventing this Warlord from being bloodied, and given our current choice of different attachments with which to affix to any of our army units, I think one fantastic choice is to use the ion rifle attached to any of your ranged attackers, so that even without the initiative token, you can nevertheless try to derive the utmost value out of that ranged skirmish round, potentially to pick off some of your enemy's most deadly attackers and units before they have any opportunity to attack you in return. And because you're triggering this reaction after she commits to a planet, as will only increase over time with our card pool, there's a built-in inherent flexibility and unpredictability to this unit as well. So if you do happen to have a unit you're affixing a Tau attachment to, your opponent might have difficulty predicting, for instance, if you're able to bolster its attack value by 2 points, or, as is the case with the ion rifle, whether you'll be able to boost it up by 3. And alternatively, if you're looking to get some defensive value out of those Tau attachments, another one of your options is the Loyal Repulsor Impact Field, which you can affix to a unit so that each and every time it suffers an enemy attack, it ultimately returns fire with a couple points of free damage in exchange. And coupled with the Tau army unit, the Fire Warrior Elite, that not only serves the purpose of protecting your Warlord, but potentially serves the additional purpose of dishing out what can potentially be a serious amount of damage to any number of big or small attacking enemy units. One of the weaknesses of Commander Shadowsun worth pointing out is that with only one signature squad exception, all of the Tau attachments we've seen thus far have to be stuck to army units, and for that reason, it makes it a little bit easier for your opponent to predict exactly where you might be sending your Warlord. Specifically because, if you're looking to take advantage of this ability, you're going to be committing her to a planet where you already have an eligible unit to receive some sort of hard-hitting, hardy, or otherwise beneficial attachment. Really, the last thing I can think of to mention about Commander Shadowsun, apart from how immensely useful being able to return potentially invaluable attachments from your discard pile back into play can be, is that as we eventually see additional Tau attachments that happen to possess shield icons, you can use up those cards without having to worry about them being gone forever, only to ultimately return them to play so that they can make all the difference on the course of a battle or the outcome of a command struggle. But in any case, seeing as how it's difficult to discuss Commander Shadowsun without Shadowsun's stealth cadre, next up we have 4 copies of that aforementioned army unit, with a cost of 2, a single command icon, the soldier and pilot traits, an attack value of 2, 2 hit points, and the text, "This card may interplay as an attachment," with the text attached to a non-vehicle army unit. Attached unit gets +2 attack and +2 hit points. So, of the utmost importance to keep in mind is that this unit has enormous inherent flexibility, in that if you're looking to win command struggles, you can deploy it as an army unit. Or, if it just so happens that you're not worried about the command phase and feel as though you already have most of the battlefield covered with an allotment of different command icon heavy units, you're certainly free to deploy this card as an attachment to make some of your potentially powerful or situationally vulnerable units hit all the harder or make them all the more durable. Although you might prefer to use Commander Shadowsun's ability to put an ion rifle into play on a ranged unit, all the same you might opt for 2 attack and 2 hit points on a more conventional unit, so that instead of hitting before your opponent manages to, Instead, you can survive multiple combat rounds in order to hit not once, but twice, potentially even more. And certainly in the right situation, opting to deploy this card as an attachment instead of a unit could make an enormous difference. For instance, you'll always experience different corner case situations, like if you happen to be running up against a Chaos player. If you can glue this onto one of your other army units, if your opponent happens to be considering playing a copy of Warp Storm, instead of losing 2 units to that potentially potent area-type source of damage, instead you could prevent all of that possible damage entirely. But regardless, for a very low cost, this versatile unit does have pretty respectable stats. It is a bit of a shame that you can't attach this to a vehicle army unit, of which the Tau have several. But given that under most circumstances you can play this card relatively carelessly or even recklessly, given your Warlord's recursive ability, no matter how you opt to play this card, it could provide an enormous benefit. I think that one of the most important aspects of this unit to consider in conjunction with your Warlord is that the only time you ever get the choice of deploying this as a unit or attachment is while this card is sitting in your hand. Because as soon as this happens to hit your discard pile, if you choose to trigger your Warlord's reaction, you only have the option of putting it into play attached to an eligible unit at her planet. Under no circumstance can you ever actually trigger that reaction in order to put this into play as an army unit. For that reason, if you do happen to have one of these in your hand, you'll have to judge very carefully whether or not this is worth putting into play, simply because not only can this potentially provide a command icon for you, but if you happen to be running up against an opponent like an Eldar, essentially putting all of your eggs in one basket by loading up one or more units with a large number of potent attachments could prove disastrous if your opponent's simply able to expend 1 or 2 card effects in order to exhaust that potent unit and negate the benefit of not just that unit, but any number of beneficial attachments it happens to possess, all at the same time. I not only like the inherent flexibility of this card, but I also enjoy that with 4 copies of this in your deck, you're likely to stumble upon one of these very early in the game, if not in your opening hand, particularly considering that you always have the option of taking 1 mulligan. And because of your Warlord's recursive ability, it's absolutely trivial to return this to play round after round, even if your opponent happens to somehow dispatch this unit or discard this as an attachment. Last but not least, I'll just mention that the powerful Tau support ambush platform is fully capable of putting Shadowsun's Stealth Cadre into play as a combat action. Deploy is a means by which cards can interplay, and as this signature army unit clearly states that it may interplay as an attachment, this text acts as a constant ability. Therefore, just like the gun drones unit mentioned explicitly in our official FAQ document, it serves to reason that the potent Tau support can indeed effectively ambush the Stealth Cadre into combat as an attachment affixed to one of your fighting units. And additionally, as it is being deployed, you can derive the additional ambush platform benefit of decreasing the required resource investment in this case by 1. Hopefully, you'll be able to leverage this trick against your opponent not only when they're expecting it the least, but when you can damage them the most. And perhaps not only through the benefit of 2 additional attack value, but hopefully in those extra 2 hit points, allowing the attached unit to survive more rounds during combat than your opponent had been anticipating and planning for. But next up, we have the Warlord friendly attachment I alluded to earlier. We have one copy of the zero-cost attachment, Command Link Drone, with a mighty 3 shield icons, the drone trait, and the text attached to a unit. Attached unit gets +1 attack power. Action: pay 1 resource token to attach this card to a different unit. So, I mentioned earlier that with this card, coupled with Commander Shadowsun's ability, it's entirely possible to use this as a shield card, soaking up an attack of 3 or less entirely, or otherwise mitigating some egregious or bloodying blow. But, once it happens to be placed in your discard pile, it's then fair game to be targeted by Shadowsun's reaction to be subsequently attached to a unit at her location. And, although it is going to be a very inconsistent draw, considering it's only 1 copy in your deck, if you don't happen to have any other options or nothing quite strikes your fancy at the time, you're very much welcome to affix this unit to your Warlord herself, which could also have the benefit of taking your opponent by surprise, just because in general they'll be expecting Commander Shadowsun to be committed to a planet where you already have pre-existing army units that could benefit from other, potentially more potent attachments. Yet another piece of text worth noting is that this card does not state it cannot be used on vehicles. So, whether you're piloting an experimental devilfish or a soaring falcon, either of those vehicle, no war gear army units are nevertheless perfectly eligible recipients for this attachment. But outside of the obvious, there nevertheless exist a handful of devious tricks that you can leverage in your favor when using this attachment. For instance, if you have resources to spare, and you're trying to postpone a big play during the deployment phase as long as possible, or collect as much information about what your enemy is playing as possible, you can trigger this action repeatedly in order to essentially starve your opponent of actions, so that you can eventually get to the point where your opponent has to either pass and give up the opportunity to deploy some nasty trick against you, or otherwise lay all of their trump cards out onto the table for you to not only clearly see, but also affords you the potentially enormously beneficial opportunity to plan ahead for whatever nasty business your opponent ends up deploying onto the table. Although depending on how late you are in the game, that might be exceptionally expensive or outright unaffordable given how many resources you might have to invest in order to starve out your opponent, it is worth considering that Commander Shadowsun's ability does, in a way, save you some valuable resources round after round, and considering exactly what faction and what warlord your opponent is playing, you may not have to pay many resources at all until you find yourself looking down at as much information as your opponent will begrudgingly have to provide. Last but not least, I'll just mention that yet another nasty trick you can use in your favor with the Command Link Drone is to affix this to a unit, to have it attack, and then once your opponent has returned fire in kind, to use that action window in order to shift this attachment to another unit in order to benefit from that attack power again and again and again. So long as you're willing to invest the resources necessary to keep shifting this attachment, this can potentially result in that one attack power ultimately making a significant difference over the course of what could quite possibly be the most decisive battle of the game. But taken at its face value, it's certainly not an enormous value that this attachment provides, But if you do have some resources to spare, or at the very least, if you're looking to generate an enormous 3 shield value, the Command Link drone, despite being an inconsistent draw, can certainly end up making a big difference over the full course of a game. And next in Shadowsun's signature squad, we have the 1-cost support Communications Relay, with the upgrade trait and interrupt. When your opponent triggers an ability that targets a unit you control with 1 or more attachments, exhaust this support to cancel its effects. So, right away, this card stands out as one of scarcely few effects that allows you to cancel or otherwise nullify the effect of some enemy card or unit entirely. For any army unit upon which you're affixing attachments, their value in your eyes and your opponent's tends to skyrocket, in that you're investing more and more resources into one place, and ultimately creating a unit that's all the more dangerous to your opponent. Unavoidably, that comes with the enormous downside of painting it out to be a huge target for your opponent. But so long as you're able to put this 1-copy support card into play, even though it's going to be extremely inconsistent and many games will run their duration without you being so fortunate, if it just so happens that you're running up against an opponent with lots of nasty targeting abilities, factions like Chaos with Tzeentch's Firestorm, or even warlords like the Eldar Eldorath Starbane, triggering this interrupt effect allows you a fantastic opportunity to prevent those effects outright. For that reason, it is worth noting that your opponent will simply try to dodge this card, for instance dealing direct damage instead to a unit that doesn't happen to have any attachments, seeing as how it would be a complete waste to play an event or trigger some kind of ability when quite clearly your opponent sees that you can utterly negate their ability to do so. But if your opponent is indeed bound and determined to ability down whatever attachment heavy unit you happen to have, this might end up in them wasting an action, ability, or event card simply to result in your having to exhaust this support and ultimately leave your army unit vulnerable. But if that does just so happen to be the case, considering that your Warlord nevertheless does possess that ability to return attachments from your discard pile back into play, taken together, this support and your Warlord, while they don't exactly punish your opponent for leveraging abilities against you, certainly provide an invaluable means of protecting some of your most worthwhile, beneficial, and useful investments. I think it's very important to notice that this is not only a very cheap support, but that this effect is indeed repeatable turn after turn, although as I mentioned it does have that cost of exhausting itself in order to trigger that interrupt, so there is an inherent limitation to how many times you can activate this each round. Also worth considering is that this support is not going to be able to protect you from more global or area type effects. For instance, the Space Marine event Exterminatus, because it targets a planet as opposed to an individual unit, any army units with or without attachments that happen to be caught up in that effect are going to be discarded regardless, and this support will do absolutely nothing to prevent that effect. But that kind of far-ranging and globally inclusive effect is few and far between given our current card pool, and there are a tremendous number of specific unit targeting events and unit abilities that this manages you to cancel or prevent entirely, namely the Dark Eldar Archon's Terror that routs units, or Tzeentch's Firestorm, like I already mentioned, that deals direct damage to specific valuable units. But there nevertheless exist myriad other threats that also pose some danger to you, such as deception that returns non-elite units to your hand, or suppressive fire, which, just like Eldorath, can have the particularly nasty effect of exhausting some of your most valuable and deadly units. But still further, the options for cancellation are almost limitless. It's not just direct damage, exhaustion, and other nasty effects that this support possesses the ability to negate entirely. It even includes cards like the Eldar event Superiority, which, for the duration of a command struggle, results in a target unit losing all of its command icons. So if your opponent is trying to harass you in a more economic sense, this support could also prove invaluable in helping to avoid, stave off, or entirely prevent an effect like that. And if you're one of those players like myself that really likes to leverage the range skirmish in your favor, this support yet again allows you to overcome the Dark Eldar support Twisted Laboratory, which can not only remove the ranged keyword from some of your key critical attachment-laden units, but serves the additional detriment of eliminating their text box entirely. As with so many other cards, as our card pool continues to expand, the utility and power inherent to this support is only going to increase. It's only going to be applicable and beneficial to more and more situations. And given again not only how powerful our existing attachments are, but that we're going to be seeing innumerable additional ones in the future, this is a card with enormous built-in value, and if you're lucky enough to manage to draw this single copy support, it could ultimately prove to be a tremendous pain in the ass for an opponent regardless of faction or warlord. But with that support more than sufficiently covered, let's move on to our final card of this signature squad. We have 2 copies of the zero-cost event, Squadron Redeployment, with a single shield icon and the tactic trait, as well as the text, exhaust an army unit with 1 or more attachments to move it to a target planet. So, immediately, I like that this event is free, and I like that it has the inherent flexibility of providing 1 shield just in case you really need to save an army unit or your warlord's skin. Of the utmost importance to consider when reading this card is that exhausting an army unit counts as a cost. So this isn't actually an event that you can use on your opponent, but instead you use this on yourself in order to shift one of your once-ready army units to any other planet on the battlefield. So long as they happen to have an attachment, of course. And therein lies a little bit of the difficulty, in that you have to have a ready target with an attachment, and whatever planet they happen to be arriving at, they ultimately show up exhausted. Also important to consider is that even though this allows you the mobility to shift one of your army units to a planet where it might be much more valuable, under normal circumstances, the obvious use for this card is to move an attachment-laden army unit from one planet to another, where it can go from serving little to no purpose to making some kind of difference on the battlefield. But, seeing as how it's going to be arriving exhausted, you're not going to be able to benefit from any number of command icons that that unit might possess. And although you can choose to play this during the combat phase, where you could potentially transport a very hard-hitting and/or durable army unit into a very thick and dangerous battle, even if you happen to wait until your opponent has used up their last combat turn, leveraging that final action window in your favor in order to shift over that army unit and then have it immediately ready upon the start of the new combat round, Unless you happen to be holding the initiative token, that unit you move is nevertheless exposed to a single volley of fire from your attacking enemy. So even if you happen to be moving a particularly durable and hard-hitting unit into the thick of battle, you do nevertheless run the risk of being exposed to what could potentially be a devastating attack, seeing as how your opponent might be able to supplement a single unit with any number of events or otherwise nasty effects. While this event certainly has the potential of paying off in spades, in that you can take your biggest investments and put them exactly where you need them, and like I mentioned, if you do happen to have initiative, you could potentially get off a devastating attack before your opponent has an opportunity to respond, and simply by the merit of your playing this during the combat phase, it might take them completely by surprise. I do think that there nevertheless exist a large number of situations where drawing this card is going to be pretty ineffectual. It's not going to be what you're needing at that time, and even though it does have that built-in shield icon, it takes a little bit of an investment into the battlefield before you can see any use of it at all, and that effect is certainly only going to be situationally useful. Having attachments in play isn't a big deal for Commander Shadowsun, but considering that you have to have the ideal army unit laden with the ideal attachment, even if they're not deployed at the ideal planet, and this does allow you a little bit of a correction, it just seems like there has to be kind of a lot going right before this card can provide any kind of significant benefit. It certainly has not just offensive, but defensive use as well, in that it's not only a shield card, but you can use this to get one of your valuable units out of a sticky situation, maybe to save yourself from enemy ranged units, or simply to prevent yourself from falling victim to an opponent holding that initiative token. But before I bring this video to an end, I'll just mention that one final use for squadron redeployment would be, before a battle ends, to shift a unit that had participated in that battle to a different planet where another battle is going to take place, so that they contribute to not only a fight at one planet, but potentially two or more, if it just so happens that that's a very durable unit, or that the individual combats are relatively light. Perhaps one of the best units to target with this event would be the Fire Warrior Elite, particularly if you've been able to attach a repulsor impact field to them, because regardless as to whether they're exhausted or not, they'll nevertheless sponge up potentially multiple enemy attacks and dish out some serious damage in return. But particularly considering the relative strength of the rest of Shadowsun's signature squad, ultimately, I think this pot of 8 cards kind of ends in a whimper. But regardless, clearly there is some fantastic synergy inherent to this squad. The stealth cadre are cheap and powerful, that built-in ability makes them extraordinarily flexible, and in the greater context of the Tau card pool, Commander Shadowsun certainly serves to provide a whole host of nasty tools for the Tau player to leverage in their favor. But with that said, I'll go ahead and bring our final core set Warlord review to a close. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel if you have not done so already. If you have your own opinion you'd like to share of Commander Shadowsun or any of her signature squad, be sure to let me know in the comments. I always like to hear about gameplay experiences from some of our more veteran players. And certainly if you'd like to share some devious tricks and nasty means of leveraging this Warlord, her ability, and signature squad in your favor, be sure to share the wealth. But as usual, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.